Jake Morrison pressed his face against the cold metal window of the mining station and watched the alien ships move through space like silver sharks. 300 years ago, his people had owned this part of the galaxy, but now humans were nothing more than workers who dug rocks from dead planets. The Zephyrian coalition treated them like useful animals who could hold tools and follow simple orders. The mining station orbited around a planet that looked like a giant blue marble with white clouds. Jake had been working here for 15 years and every day felt the same. Wake up at 6 in the morning, eat the tasteless protein bars, climb into the mining suits, and spend 12 hours breaking apart asteroids for rare metals. The Zephyrians paid them just enough to stay alive and nothing more. Jake was 42 years old and his hands were already scarred from years of hard work. His father had told him stories about the old days when humans had been feared warriors who could defeat entire alien fleets with nothing but smart thinking and old ships. Those stories seemed like fairy tales now. The humans Jake knew were tired people who kept their heads down and did what they were told. The other miners called Jake crazy because he still believed the old stories. They said humans had never been great warriors, and their grandfathers had made up those tales to feel better about being conquered. Jake knew they were wrong, but he could never prove it. The Zephyrians had destroyed most human records from the war years, and what little remained was locked away in their archives on. This particular morning, Jake was leading a small mining crew to a new asteroid field that the Zephyrians had discovered. The crew included Maria Santos, who had been an engineer before the coalition made her a miner, Danny Foster, who was only 25 and dreamed of flying real spaceships instead of mining pods, and 6 other humans who just wanted to finish their work and go home. The asteroid field looked like a giant graveyard of broken rocks floating in empty space. Their job was to find the rocks that contained the rare metals the Zephyrians needed for their technology. It was boring work that could take weeks to complete. Jake guided their mining ship deeper into the field, while Maria checked the scanners for valuable deposits. Danny was piloting one of the smaller pods when his scanner picked up something unusual. Instead of metal deposits, he found what looked like artificial structures buried deep inside one of the larger asteroids. He called Jake over the radio and told him about the strange readings. Jake told him to investigate, but to be careful because sometimes old mining equipment got left behind in asteroid fields. What Danny found was not old mining equipment. As he used his cutting tools to break through the asteroid's outer shell, he discovered a massive hollow space inside. His pod's lights revealed smooth metal walls and corridors that disappeared into darkness. This was not natural rock formation, but something that had been built by intelligent beings many years ago. Jake brought the main ship over, and they managed to create a temporary seal so they could enter the hollow asteroid without their spacesuits. The air inside was stale but breathable. Their flashlights revealed corridors lined with human writing and symbols that Jake recognized from his father's old stories. This was a human military facility that had been hidden inside the asteroid for hundreds of years. They walked through empty corridors that still showed signs of the people who had once lived and worked here. Maria found storage rooms filled with weapons and equipment that looked more advanced than anything the Zephyrians used. Danny discovered a hangar bay that contained small fighter ships designed for human pilots. Jake found something even more important in what looked like the command center. The computers were old but still working. When Jake managed to activate them, he found thousands of files containing military records, tactical manuals, and training programs from humanity's golden age of space warfare. The files told the story of Admiral Lisa Hayes, who had defeated 3 alien empires using nothing but clever tactics and determination. There were battle plans, weapon designs, and most importantly, the complete philosophy of human military thinking. Jake spent hours reading through the files while Maria and Danny explored other parts of the facility. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about human history. His people had not been lucky amateurs who got crushed by superior alien technology. They had been brilliant warriors who understood that winning wars was about more than having better weapons. They knew how to turn their enemies' strengths into weaknesses and how to fight battles that could not be won using normal methods. The records showed that humans had been masters of what the military files called asymmetric warfare. When facing enemies with better ships and weapons, humans would use surprise attacks, psychological warfare, and tactics that other species considered dishonorable or crazy. They would sacrifice empty planets to set traps, use civilian ships as weapons, and attack supply lines instead of military targets. Most importantly, they never gave up even when the situation seemed hopeless. Admiral Hayes had written in one of her tactical reports that humanity's greatest advantage was their willingness to break the rules that other species followed. While aliens fought with predictable patterns based on honor and tradition, humans would do whatever it took to win. This made them unpredictable and dangerous opponents who could defeat much larger forces through superior planning and execution. Jake realized that this hidden facility was more than just an old military base. It was proof that humans had once been everything the old stories claimed they were. More importantly, it contained the knowledge and tools that could help humans become great warriors again. The weapons and ships in the facility were old, but they were built using principles that were still valid. The tactical manuals contained lessons that could be applied to modern warfare. As Jake looked around at the forgotten facility, he made a decision that would change his life and the lives of every human in the galaxy. He would keep this discovery secret until he could figure out how to use it. The Zephyrians had made a mistake by treating humans like simple miners and laborers. They had forgotten that every human carried the genes of warriors who had once brought empires to their knees. Jake was going to help his people remember what they really were. Jake spent the next 3 weeks making regular trips to the hidden facility, while pretending to mine asteroids in the same area. He brought Maria and Danny with him each time, and slowly they began to understand what they had discovered. The facility contained enough weapons and equipment to arm a small army, but more importantly, it held the knowledge that could teach humans how to be warriors again. Maria was amazed by the engineering principles she found in the weapon designs and ship blueprints. The human military had built everything to be simple, reliable, and easy to repair using basic materials. Unlike Zephyrian technology that required rare metals and complex manufacturing processes, human military equipment could be built and maintained by anyone with basic technical skills. This meant human forces could operate independently without supply lines or support bases. Danny was fascinated by the fighter ship designs and training manuals. The human pilots had been taught to think like predators who hunted in packs. They used speed and surprise to attack weak points in enemy formations, and then disappeared before the enemy could respond. The training programs emphasized creativity and independent thinking, rather than following rigid battle plans. Every pilot was expected to adapt to changing situations and find new ways to complete their missions. Jake focused on the strategic and tactical manuals written by Admiral Hayes and other human military leaders. These documents revealed that human military thinking was completely different from what other species used. While aliens planned battles like chess games with predictable moves and countermoves, humans treated warfare like a form of organized chaos where anything could happen and the winner was whoever adapted fastest to changing conditions. The three humans began meeting secretly each night after their regular mining shifts to study the archived materials and practice the techniques they learned. Maria worked on understanding the weapon systems and how to modify civilian equipment into military hardware. Danny used the flight simulators in the facility to learn how to pilot the old fighter ships. Jake memorized the tactical principles and began planning how they could be applied to their current situation. After a month of secret study, Jake decided they needed to test their new knowledge. He chose a small Zephyrian supply convoy that regularly passed through their mining sector as their first target. According to the tactical manuals, the best way to attack a superior enemy was to hit their supply lines and avoid direct confrontation with their military forces. Jake planned an operation that would look like an accident rather than an attack. They used their mining equipment to create a debris field in the convoy's path and then waited in their small mining ship for the Zephyrians to arrive. When the supply ship slowed down to navigate through the debris, Jake and his team used modified mining tools to disable their engines and communication systems. They boarded the ships wearing their normal mining suits and told the crew they were there to help with repairs. The Zephyrian crew never suspected that the helpful human miners were actually raiders. Jake's team quickly identified which supplies would be most useful and loaded them onto their mining ship while pretending to work on the engine repairs. They took weapons, communication equipment, and most importantly, detailed star charts that showed Zephyrian military positions throughout the sector. The entire operation took less than 2 hours, and the supply convoy continued on its way without realizing they had been robbed. Jake was amazed at how well the old human tactics worked against modern enemies. The Zephyrians were so used to humans being harmless workers that they never considered the possibility of human raiders. Their military thinking was rigid and predictable, which made them vulnerable to the kind of flexible tactics that humans had once used to defeat much stronger enemies. Encouraged by their success, Jake began planning larger operations. He reached out carefully to other human communities in nearby mining stations and worker colonies. He shared some of the tactical knowledge they had discovered and began recruiting people who were tired of being treated like slaves. The response was better than he had hoped because many humans had been waiting for someone to show them a way to fight back. Within 3 months, Jake had assembled a network of 30 humans spread across 6 different mining facilities. They included former engineers like Maria, who could modify equipment into weapons, pilots like Danny who could fly stolen ships, and workers who were willing to take risks for the chance to be something more than laborers. Each person was carefully chosen for their skills and their hatred of Zephyrian rule. The network began conducting small operations against Zephyrian installations throughout the sector. They sabotaged mining equipment, intercepted supply shipments, and gathered intelligence about military movements. Each operation was designed to look like accidents or equipment failures rather than organized resistance. The Zephyrians noticed the problems but attributed them to the normal inefficiency of human workers rather than deliberate sabotage. While Jake's network was growing stronger, the galaxy was facing a much larger threat. Reports had been coming in for months about something called the Void Wraiths that was attacking systems on the edge of Zephyrian space. These were not living beings, but some kind of ancient machine intelligence that consumed entire planets and turned the raw materials into more machines. The Zephyrian military had tried to fight them using conventional tactics, but every battle ended in defeat. Jake obtained copies of Zephyrian military reports through his network and studied how the Void Wraiths fought. What he discovered worried him greatly. The machine intelligences were not just destroying Zephyrian forces but learning from each battle. They adapted their tactics based on what their enemies did and became more effective with each engagement. The rigid military doctrine that the Zephyrians used was actually making the enemy stronger by providing predictable patterns to analyze and counter according to the reports. The Void Wraiths had already consumed 12-star systems and were advancing deeper into Coalition space. The Zephyrian fleets sent to stop them were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Worse yet, the machines seemed to be specifically targeting military installations and industrial centers, while leaving civilian populations alive but helpless. This suggested they were not mindless destroyers, but intelligent strategists with long-term plans. Jake realized that the Void Wraith threat might actually be an opportunity for humans to prove their worth. The enemy was winning because they could predict and counter conventional military tactics, but human military doctrine was based on being unpredictable and doing things that seemed crazy or impossible. If anyone could defeat an enemy that learned from battle, it would be warriors, who never fought the same way twice. The question was whether Jake could convince the Zephyrians to trust humans with real military responsibility. The Coalition had spent 3 centuries treating humans like children, who could not be trusted with dangerous tools or important decisions. Asking them to give humans warships and the authority to fight a war would require proof that humans were capable of more than mining asteroids and following orders. Jake began planning an operation that would demonstrate human military capabilities to the Zephyrian leadership. He would need to show them that humans could succeed where Zephyrian forces had failed. More importantly, he would need to do it in a way that proved humans understood warfare better than any other species in the galaxy. The old stories his father had told him were about to become reality again. 6 months after discovering the hidden military facility, Jake's small group of miners had grown into something much larger and more dangerous. Word had spread quietly through human communities across dozens of worlds that someone was teaching the old ways of fighting. People who had spent their entire lives following Zephyrian orders were suddenly learning that their ancestors had been legendary warriors who could defeat any enemy through clever thinking and determination. Carol Bennett was one of the new recruits who joined Jake's growing network. She had worked as a communications technician on a Zephyrian military base for 20 years and knew how to access their secure networks without being detected. Carol brought Jake detailed intelligence about coalition military movements and battle reports from the war against the Void Wraiths. The information she provided was more valuable than any weapon, because it showed exactly how badly the Zephyrians were losing. Rick Coleman was another important addition to the network. He had been trained as a weapons technician before the Coalition relegated him to repairing mining equipment. Rick studied the archived human weapon designs and figured out how to build military-grade equipment using materials that could be obtained from civilian sources. Within weeks, he was producing modified blasters, communication jammers, and targeting systems that were superior to standard Zephyrian military equipment. The network now included over 200 humans spread across 30 different facilities and colonies. They communicated using a secure system that Carol had developed, based on old human military encryption methods. Each cell operated independently so that if one group was discovered, it could not compromise the others. Jake had learned this principle from Admiral Hayes's tactical manuals, which emphasized that successful resistance movements must be able to survive even when individual units were captured or destroyed. The operations they conducted were becoming bolder and more sophisticated. Instead of simple sabotage, they began launching coordinated attacks against multiple targets simultaneously. They would hit supply depots on 3 different worlds at the same time, while jamming communications to prevent the Zephyrians from coordinating their response. By the time Coalition forces figured out what was happening, the human raiders had already disappeared with their stolen supplies and equipment. Jake's favorite operation was the attack on the military training facility on Kepler 442c, where young Zephyrian officers learned their rigid battle tactics. His team infiltrated the base during a training exercise and reprogrammed the simulation computers to show human tactical scenarios instead of standard Coalition doctrine. For 3 days, the Zephyrian cadets unknowingly practiced fighting like humans using flexible tactics and creative problem-solving. The instructors were confused by the unusual scenarios, but the cadets performed better than they ever had before. The psychological impact of the operation was exactly what Jake had hoped for. Some of the young Zephyrian officers began questioning why their military doctrine was so inflexible compared to the human tactical approaches they had practiced in the simulations. A few even began studying archived human military records to understand why the scenarios had been so effective. Jake knew that doubt and curiosity were powerful weapons against rigid thinking. While the human resistance network was growing stronger, the war against the Void Wraiths was going from bad to worse for the Coalition. Carol's intelligence reports showed that the machine intelligences had consumed 18 star systems and were advancing toward the core worlds of Zephyrian space. Every fleet sent to stop them was being destroyed more quickly than the previous one because the Void Wraiths were learning from each battle and becoming more effective. The most disturbing reports described how the Void Wraiths fought. They would analyze Coalition battle formations and tactics during the first few minutes of combat, and then adapt their own strategies to counter whatever the Zephyrians did. If the Coalition used long-range bombardment, the machines would close to short range and use boarding tactics. If the Zephyrians tried to use superior numbers, the Void Wraiths would split their forces and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Jake realized that the Void Wraiths were winning because they could think faster and more flexibly than their organic enemies. The Coalition military doctrine was based on centuries of tradition and honor codes that made their actions predictable. Against an enemy that could adapt in real time, these predictable tactics were worse than useless because they provided the machines with patterns to analyze and exploit. The solution was obvious to anyone who understood human military thinking. The Void Wraiths could only adapt to tactics they could predict and analyze. But human warfare was based on doing things that seemed random or impossible to enemies who thought logically. If you never used the same tactic twice and always did something unexpected, the enemy could not build effective countermeasures against you. Jake began developing a plan to demonstrate human military capabilities directly to Coalition leadership. He needed to prove that humans could succeed where Zephyrian forces had failed, but he also needed to do it in a way that would force the Coalition to recognize humans as equals rather than useful tools. The operation would have to be spectacular, enough to get the attention of the highest levels of government and military command. The opportunity came when Carol intercepted communications about a major coalition fleet that was preparing to make what the Zephyrians called a final stand against the Void Wraiths at the Meridian system. The fleet included over 300 warships commanded by the Coalition's best admirals, using their most advanced tactical doctrines. According to the battle plans, they intended to use massive firepower and superior numbers to overwhelm the Void Wraiths. Before the machines could adapt to their strategies, Jake knew the battle plan would fail because it was exactly the kind of predictable, large-scale assault that the Void Wraiths had learned to counter. The machines would analyze the Coalition formation, identify weak points, and then destroy the fleet piece by piece while adapting to every move the Zephyrians made. It would be the largest military disaster in Coalition history and might lead to the complete conquest of their remaining worlds, but it would also be the perfect opportunity to show the galaxy what humans could accomplish when they were allowed to fight like warriors instead of laborers. Jake began planning an operation that would put human forces in position to intervene in the battle, using tactics that no machine intelligence would be able to predict or counter. He would need ships, weapons, and most importantly, official recognition from the Coalition that humans had the right to participate in their own defense. The first step was to make contact with Coalition military leadership and convince them to listen to his proposal. Jake knew this would be the most dangerous part of the plan, because it meant revealing the existence of his resistance network and trusting that the Zephyrians would not simply arrest all of them for treason. But he also knew that desperate people were more likely to consider desperate solutions. Jake sent a carefully worded message to Admiral Keith Vor, the Zephyrian commander who was leading the Meridian operation. The message contained detailed intelligence about Void Wraith tactics that could only have come from someone with access to classified Coalition military reports. More importantly, it included tactical recommendations based on human military doctrine that offered solutions to problems the Zephyrians had been unable to solve. The message concluded with a simple offer: give humans a chance to fight the Void Wraiths using human methods, or watch the Coalition fall to an enemy that could counter every traditional tactic. Jake knew the proposal sounded crazy to beings who had spent centuries thinking of humans as primitive laborers. But he also knew that Admiral Kethvor had lost too many battles to ignore any possibility of victory, no matter how unlikely it seemed. 3 days later, Jake received a response that changed everything. Admiral Kethvor wanted to meet with him personally to discuss his proposal. The meeting would take place on a neutral station, where Jake would have safe passage to present his ideas to Coalition military leadership. It was the chance Jake had been waiting for, but it was also a risk that could destroy everything he had built if the Zephyrians decided humans were too dangerous to be allowed to live freely. Jake stood in the conference room aboard the neutral station and faced the most powerful military leaders in the Zephyrian Coalition. Admiral Kethvor was a tall, crystalline being whose body reflected light in patterns that showed his emotional state. The other officers around the table represented different alien species, but they all shared the same expression of skeptical curiosity about the human who claimed he could win battles that their best commanders had lost. The meeting began with Admiral Kethvor reviewing the intelligence that Jake had provided about Void Wraith tactics. The information was accurate and detailed enough to prove that Jake had access to classified military reports. But the Admiral wanted to know how a mining station supervisor had obtained such sensitive data. Jake explained that humans throughout the Coalition had been watching and learning from their alien employers for 3 centuries, and many of them worked in positions where they could observe military operations. When Admiral Kethvor asked why humans had been gathering military intelligence, Jake gave him an honest answer. Humans had never stopped thinking of themselves as warriors even though the Coalition treated them like laborers. They studied alien military methods because they hoped someday they would have the chance to fight alongside their rulers instead of just digging rocks for them. The Admiral seemed surprised by this explanation because he had never considered that humans might have ambitions beyond their assigned roles. Jake then began his presentation about human military doctrine and why it would be effective against the Void Wraiths. He explained that human warriors had always specialized in fighting enemies who were stronger, smarter, or more numerous than they were. The key to human success was never trying to match enemy strengths, but instead finding ways to turn those strengths into weaknesses through unpredictable tactics and creative problem-solving. The alien officers listened with growing interest as Jake described battle techniques that were completely foreign to their way of thinking. Humans would sacrifice territory to set traps, use civilian ships as weapons, and attack supply lines instead of military targets. Most importantly, they would change their tactics constantly to prevent enemies from adapting to their methods. Every battle was treated as a unique problem that required a unique solution. Admiral Keth Vor interrupted to ask how these unorthodox methods could be effective against an enemy that learned from every encounter. Jake explained that the Void Wraiths could only learn from tactics they could analyze and understand. Human warfare was designed to be chaotic and illogical, from the perspective of enemies who thought in predictable patterns. If you never did the same thing twice and always chose the option that seemed least rational, the enemy could not build effective countermeasures against you. To demonstrate his point, Jake presented a detailed analysis of the Coalition's planned assault on the Meridian system. He showed how the battle formation and tactical approach would allow the Void Wraiths to predict and counter every move the Coalition forces made. The machines would identify the command ships, target the communication networks, and isolate individual units that could be destroyed separately. The entire fleet would be wiped out within hours because their tactics were too predictable. Jake then presented an alternative battle plan based on human military principles. Instead of a massive coordinated assault, he proposed using small independent units that would attack from multiple directions, using different tactics simultaneously. Some ships would use long-range bombardment while others closed for boarding actions. Some units would target military installations while others attacked supply lines and communication networks. The Void Wraiths would be unable to adapt because there would be no consistent pattern to analyze. The alien officers were shocked by the unconventional nature of Jake's proposals. Several of them objected that his tactics violated basic principles of military honor and would result in unnecessary casualties among their own forces. Jake replied, that honor was a luxury that could only be afforded by species that were winning their wars. Humans had learned long ago that survival was more important than reputation, and victory was more valuable than the respect of enemies who wanted to kill you. Admiral Keth Vor asked the most important question of the meeting. Even if human tactics were theoretically effective, how could Jake prove that humans were capable of executing them successfully? The Coalition had no evidence that modern humans possessed the skills and knowledge that their ancestors had supposedly used centuries ago. For all anyone knew, the old stories about human military prowess were just myths created by a defeated people to make themselves feel better about their current status. Jake had been waiting for this question, and he had prepared his answer carefully. He activated a portable display screen and showed the Admiral detailed recordings of the operations his resistance network had conducted over the past 6 months. The footage showed human teams infiltrating Zephyrian military bases, sabotaging equipment and stealing supplies using tactics that were clearly based on professional military training, rather than amateur improvisation. The alien officers watched in stunned silence as the recordings revealed that humans had been conducting successful military operations right under their noses for months without being detected. The operations demonstrated planning, coordination, and execution skills that were far beyond what anyone had thought humans possessed. Most disturbing from the Coalition's perspective was the realization that their security measures had been completely ineffective against human infiltration techniques. Admiral Keth Vor demanded to know how many humans were involved in these illegal activities and whether Jake was threatening the Coalition with some kind of uprising. Jake assured him that the Resistance Network was not planning a revolution against Zephyrian rule, but was instead offering to use their skills in service of the Coalition's war effort. The humans wanted the chance to fight as warriors rather than workers, and they were willing to prove their loyalty by facing the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever seen. The proposal Jake made was simple and direct. Give him command of a small fleet made up of ships that were scheduled to be scrapped, and crews recruited from human mining colonies and work camps. Allow him to test human tactics against the Void Wraiths in a limited engagement where failure would not compromise the main Coalition fleet. If the humans succeeded, they would earn the right to participate fully in the war effort. If they failed, the Coalition would have lost nothing more than some obsolete ships and expendable workers. The conference room fell silent as the alien officers considered Jake's offer. Several of them clearly thought the idea was insane and wanted to reject it immediately. But Admiral Keth Vor had lost too many battles and too many good officers to dismiss any possibility of victory. The Void Wraiths were advancing toward the core worlds of Coalition space, and conventional tactics had proven completely ineffective against them. After nearly an hour of private discussion among the alien officers, Admiral Keth Vor announced the Coalition's decision. Jake would be given command of 12 obsolete warships and allowed to recruit crews from human populations throughout Coalition space. His force would be assigned to defend the outer system of Meridian, while the main Coalition fleet engaged the Void Wraiths in the inner system. If the humans could prevent any enemy forces from escaping to spread intelligence about Coalition tactics, they would be considered to have proven their worth. Jake accepted the assignment knowing that he was being given the most dangerous part of the battle with the least chance of survival. The Coalition leaders expected him to fail, and were using his force as an expendable delaying action that might buy a few extra minutes for their main fleet. But Jake also knew that this was exactly the kind of impossible situation where human tactics worked best. When everyone expected you to lose, you had the freedom to try methods that seemed too crazy for anyone else to attempt. As Jake left the conference room to begin assembling his fleet, he felt the weight of 3 centuries of human history on his shoulders. His people had been treated as second-class citizens for so long that most of them had forgotten what they were capable of achieving. The upcoming battle would either prove that humans deserved to be respected as equals, or it would confirm that they were nothing more than useful laborers who had delusions of grandeur. But Jake remembered the tactical manuals he had studied and the weapons his people had built in secret. Most importantly, he remembered that humans had never been defeated by superior technology or overwhelming numbers. They had only been beaten when they forgot how to think like warriors and started acting like victims. The Void Wraiths were about to learn why the galaxy had once feared the name of humanity. News of Jake's assignment spread through human communities across the galaxy like wildfire. For the first time in 3 centuries, humans were being asked to fight as warriors instead of working as laborers. Volunteers came from mining stations, construction crews, and agricultural colonies. Many of them had never seen military combat, but all of them carried the genetic memory of ancestors who had once brought alien empires to their knees. Through courage and clever thinking, Maria Santos became Jake's chief engineer and spent 2 weeks modifying the 12 obsolete Coalition warships using principles from the archived human military designs. The ships had been scheduled for scrapping because their weapons and defense systems were outdated by Coalition standards. But Maria discovered that older technology was actually an advantage because it was simpler to repair and modify using basic materials that could be found anywhere in space. Danny Foster was promoted to squadron commander and began training human pilots to fly the modified ships using tactics from Admiral Hayes's fighter pilot manuals. The new pilots learned to think like pack hunters who used speed and surprise to attack weak points in enemy formations. Unlike Coalition pilots who followed rigid battle plans, the humans were taught to improvise and adapt their tactics based on whatever opportunities they found during combat. Carol Bennett established communication networks that would allow Jake's fleet to coordinate with human resistance cells throughout Coalition space. Rick Coleman mass-produced weapons and equipment using manufacturing techniques that could turn civilian materials into military-grade hardware within hours. The entire human war effort was based on the principle that warriors should be able to fight effectively, even when cut off from supply lines and support bases. Within 3 weeks, Jake had assembled a fleet of 12 ships crewed by 800 humans who were eager to prove what their species could accomplish when given the chance to fight. The ships looked old and battered compared to the sleek vessels of the main Coalition fleet, but they had been rebuilt according to human military principles that emphasized reliability and adaptability over appearance and raw firepower. The Battle of Meridian began exactly as Jake had predicted it would. The Coalition fleet moved into the inner system, using standard battle formations and engagement protocols that the Void Wraiths had learned to counter during previous battles. Within the first hour of combat, it became clear that the alien machines were once again adapting faster than the Coalition forces could change their tactics. Jake's human fleet was positioned in the outer system where they were supposed to prevent any Void Wraith units from escaping to carry intelligence about Coalition battle methods back to the main enemy force. But Jake had no intention of following a defensive strategy that would waste his ships on a hopeless delaying action. Instead, he implemented a battle plan that Admiral Hayes would have recognized and approved of. The human ships split into 4 independent squadrons that approached the Void Wraith positions from different directions using completely different tactics. Danny's squadron used hit-and-run attacks with modified fighter craft that could penetrate enemy defenses and attack weak points before disappearing back into space. Maria's engineering teams turned cargo ships into improvised weapons platforms that could deliver devastating surprise attacks before being abandoned by their crews. Carol's squadron focused on disrupting Void Wraith communications and coordination by jamming their signals and spreading false information through their networks. Rick's teams used boarding actions and sabotage to capture enemy ships and turn their own weapons against them. Each squadron operated independently, but they coordinated their attacks to create maximum confusion and prevent the enemy from developing effective countermeasures. The Void Wraiths tried to adapt to the human tactics but found it impossible because there were no consistent patterns to analyze. Every time they developed a response to one type of attack, the humans would switch to something completely different. The machine intelligences became trapped in analysis loops where they spent more time trying to understand human behavior than actually fighting the battle. Jake's most successful innovation was the use of captured Void Wraith ships as weapons against their former masters. Human boarding teams would seize control of damaged enemy vessels and reprogram their weapon systems to attack other Void Wraith units. The machine intelligences could not defend against this tactic because it meant their own technology was being used in ways they had never been designed to anticipate. The turning point of the battle came when Jake realized that the Void Wraiths were concentrating their forces to deal with the unpredictable human attacks. This left them vulnerable to a coordinated assault by the main coalition fleet if someone could provide targeting information and tactical coordination. Jake contacted Admiral Kethvor and offered to guide the coalition ships to weak points in the Void Wraith formation that his forces had identified through their chaotic attacks. The combined assault proved devastatingly effective. While the Void Wraiths were still trying to analyze and counter human tactics, the coalition fleet struck their exposed command units with overwhelming firepower. The machine intelligences found themselves caught between unpredictable human raiders and the concentrated might of the coalition's heavy warships. For the first time since the war began, the Void Wraiths were forced to retreat instead of adapting and advancing. The victory at Meridian sent shockwaves throughout coalition space and beyond. Human military units had not only survived their first major battle in 3 centuries, but had actually achieved something that the coalition's best commanders had thought impossible. The supposedly primitive miners and laborers had outfought an enemy that had been defeating advanced alien military forces for months. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that human tactical thinking was uniquely suited to warfare against adaptive enemies. While other species tried to perfect their methods and stick to proven strategies, humans embraced chaos and unpredictability as natural advantages. They were the only warriors in the galaxy who became more effective when situations became more desperate and confusing. Within weeks of the Meridian victory, human military recruitment centers were established on every world with a significant human population. Young people who had grown up thinking they would spend their lives mining asteroids or building space stations suddenly had the opportunity to become pilots, engineers, and tactical officers in a growing human fleet. The psychological impact was enormous, because it reminded an entire species that they were descended from legends. Jake found himself promoted from mining supervisor to admiral of the newly formed Human Defense Force, but more than titles or recognition, he had achieved something that seemed impossible just months earlier. He had helped his people remember what they really were beneath the surface of 3 centuries of forced subservience. Humans were not farmers or miners or construction workers. They were warriors who refused to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. The war against the Void Wraiths continued for 2 more years, but the outcome was never again in doubt after the Battle of Meridian. Human tactical innovations broke the deadlock that had allowed the machine intelligences to advance unchecked through coalition space. More importantly, the success of human military units inspired other species to experiment with unconventional tactics instead of relying on traditional methods that the enemy could predict and counter. When the final Void Wraith stronghold was destroyed, it was human boarding teams that planted the explosives while human pilots provided cover, and human engineers disabled the enemy's defensive systems. The victory belonged to the entire coalition. But everyone knew that it would not have been possible without the warriors who had been hiding in plain sight as miners and laborers. For 300 years, Jake Morrison had started the war as a forgotten mining captain who believed old stories about human military greatness. He ended it as Admiral Morrison, architect of humanity's return to its rightful place among the warriors of the galaxy. But the greatest victory was not the defeat of the Void Wraiths or the recognition of human capabilities by alien governments. The greatest victory was that humans had remembered who they were and would never again allow anyone to treat them as anything less than the legends they had always been.